Szanowni Państwo, witajcie w 2019 roku. Rok, który kończył tę dekadę, jest najciekawszym i najważniejszym czasem od lat. Niemniej warto zadać sobie pytanie, na ile wydarzenia najbliższych 12 miesięcy będą stanowiły o przełomie, a na ile wiele się wydarzy, a nie zmieni się nic. Parę tygodni temu na ustach świata był tekst z New York Timesa, w którym opisano dylematy prezydenta USA, który w gronie najbliższych współpracowników rozważa wyjście z NATO. Te rozmowy odbywały się w trakcie narastającej wojny handlowej i technologicznej z Chinami, a my znowu zaczęliśmy rozmawiać o wielkiej geopolityce. Już w maju, w cieniu nadciągającego Brexitu, odbędą się wybory europejskie. Tradycyjne partie słabną, a populiści szykują się do szturmu na Brukselę. Tandem francusko-niemiecki traci na znaczeniu, a kraje południa czy wschodu częściej się kłócą niż zgadzają. Tymczasem w Polsce w październiku wybory zamkną klamrą 30 lat naszej transformacji. Wiele wskazuje na to, że wbrew sondażom scena polityczna zostanie wywrócona do góry nogami, a pokolenie żyjące okrągłym stołem, nocną zmianą czy szafą Lesiaka zostanie odsunięte w cień. Nadejdą nowi ludzie, nowe spory, nowe problemy. A może jest zupełnie inaczej. USA pozostaną w NATO, a Donald Trump wyciszy konflikty z Chinami, Rosją czy Europą. Brukselskie stanowiska rozdysponują pomiędzy sobą największe unijne kraje, a o fotel premiera RP zawalczy, jak co 4 lata, PiS z Platformą. I wszystko będzie tak jak dawniej. Proszę Państwa, żyjemy w niezmiennie ciekawych czasach. Każdego dnia może wydarzyć się coś, co wywróci nasz świat do góry nogami. A z drugiej strony siły trwania i starego porządku nie próżnują. Dlatego z olbrzymią przyjemnością chciałem Państwa zaprosić do wysłuchania 4 rozmów, w których odpowiemy na pytanie, jak będzie wyglądała Polska, Europa i świat za najbliższe 12 miesięcy. Podejmiemy próbę uporządkowania naszej chaotycznej codzienności. Innymi słowy, postaramy się Państwu pokazać, w jaki sposób w polityce Insight mierzymy się z niesamowicie trudnym, ale zarazem cudownie ekscytującym zadaniem, jakim jest opisywanie świata dla naszych abonentów. Bo dzisiejsza konferencja i nasza wspólna rozmowa jest możliwa dzięki Wam, przyjaciołom polityki Insight i odbiorcom naszych usług analitycznych. Ale także dzięki naszym partnerom. W tym miejscu chciałbym podziękować partnerowi głównemu naszej konferencji Orange Polska, także partnerom wspierającym, Ambasadzie Wielkiej Brytanii w Polsce, Facebookowi, Fundacji Promocji Pojazdów Elektrycznych, Infarmie, Geronimo Martins Polska, Polskiemu Funduszowi Rozwoju, UPC Polska oraz firmie Helen Norton. I teraz, proszę Państwa, zanim zaczniemy, mam jedną uwagę porządkową. Nie wiem, czy organizowali Państwo kiedyś konferencję, ale mogę Wam zdradzić, że zawsze wszystko się zmienia w ostatnim momencie. Niestety pani minister Jadwiga Emilewicz nie weźmie udziału, tak jak było zaplanowane, w panelu o 12:00, natomiast zastąpi ją pani posłanka Joanna Lichocka, a pani minister Emilewicz weźmie udział w panelu gospodarczym, który rozpoczyna się o 16:45, na który Państwa zapraszam. I teraz oddam głos Markowi Świerczyńskiemu. Marek przedstawi swoich gości i swój panel. Marku, zapraszam.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Good morning to all of you. Dziękuję Andrzeju. Thank you very much, Andrzej. I need to speak in English. Translation is provided. Thank you once again for coming to see us, our friends, because our relations with you are not as if we are the providers and you are customers. We are all friends. The panel that will start our conference today is the one that probably touches the most important issues in the world today. We're going to discuss the status of transatlantic relations, security and defense, NATO in 20 years since Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary have entered the alliance. That was a remarkable moment, and this is one of the moments we are celebrating this year. After last year's glorious centenary of Polish independence, this year marks also important anniversaries from the 30 years of regaining political independence and throwing out communists from the government of the country through the accession to NATO and the accession to the European Union. Let me introduce the panelists, and while I'll greet them and invite to take their seats, I will briefly describe the idea behind the first discussion. 20 years in NATO. Well, from a lifetime perspective, 20 years is the moment that you sort of begin to understand what is happening around you. This is the moment that Poland is actually now, in terms of its presence in the transatlantic community. And of course, this is the moment that this transatlantic community is going through difficulties. And this is exactly the issues that will be discussed during the panel. We thought that we needed primarily someone with a deep knowledge of the US politics and the US policies. And therefore, I'm so glad that Karen Donfried, the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, has accepted our invitation. Karen, please take your seat. Karen has served in the US administration. She's been director for European Affairs in the National Security Council, that is in the White House. And she now serves as the president, as I said, of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the very institution that, you know, carries the transatlantic flag very proudly and very high still. Thank you. But we also thought that we need someone to link the United States and Poland. Someone who knows Poland, someone who studies Poland, someone who debates Poland, and someone who has a Polish husband. So I guess we will all agree that there's only one person. Anne Applebaum, please. And of course, we all know Anne Applebaum as author, as columnist, as an avid commentator of events, not only in the United States, but also in transatlantic relations and in Poland. But that wasn't enough. We also thought that we need someone from Europe. And in the security and defense dimension, the country in Europe that we need most, not least due to geography, is Germany. And this is why we asked Constanze Stelzenmüller to join us, please. Constanze, take a new. Constanze is working for, you know, many institutions, primarily Brookings Institution.
It's actually my main employer.
And and she's probably one of the most active participants in the security and defense and foreign relations debates in Europe. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
But that still wasn't enough, because in this changed security landscape, we thought that we very much needed someone from the other side. And I mean the other side. That wasn't that wasn't an easy task, because, you know,
Russia?
but what have we our friends for? And you know, it is my honor to invite Henry Foy, who has been the friend of Politica Insight since the creation of our service. Henry, please take your seat. And Henry is heading the Financial Times bureau in Moscow.
Indeed, and I will speak an opinion about Russia, not Russia's opinion.
Okay. So, thank you very much to all of you. I will encourage our friends and guests to think about questions, because obviously we will leave a significant portion of this panel for a Q&A session at the end. I guess we can also count on you to add to this discussion, because, you know, this is what conferences are all about, to talk with each other. And in this friendly environment, I would, yes, invite you to kick it off. The usual family photo of the transatlantic community takes place usually in February in Munich. And 3 of you have just arrived from the Munich Security Conference. I must admit that for anyone who cares about NATO and who cares about the quality of transatlantic relations, it has been a painstaking experience to read reports from the Munich conference and to follow the debates there. Not everything was open for the public to see, at least from Warsaw, but I would very much count on your insights from the depth of the corridors of the Bayerischer Hof in Munich. Or in
And the cellars.
Was it that bad, really, Karen?
Well, it's great because you've got 3 of us who were in Munich over the weekend, and it was interesting because your opening graphic could have been pieces of a puzzle, and that was actually the theme of the Munich Security Conference this year.
To pick up the puzzles,
picking up
yes.
the puzzle pieces. And I'm not sure any of us came away with a good answer to who is going to pick up those pieces and whether it's going to be done collectively or individually. But let me mention 2 positive aspects of the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. One that was very striking for me as an American is that 50 members of the U.S. Congress were in Munich. That is the largest number of members of Congress you've ever had at the Munich Security Conference. It was a bipartisan show of support for the U.S. relationship with Europe and for NATO, for the alliance. And I thought that was striking. It included also the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And the second positive surprise I had was the speech that the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, gave. I have never heard her give a speech in the style in which she delivered her remarks in Munich. They were personal, they were engaging, and I thought she tackled head-on some of the most difficult issues in the transatlantic relationship. And maybe didn't offer a solution or a way to solve them, but was very open in her thinking about those issues. So those were 2 positive things that I'll start off by highlighting.
Mm-hmm. And she got arguably the largest wave of applause after her speech, contrary to the one by the US Vice President Mike Pence.
Well, and that's what a lot of the press reports have focused on, is this sort of point-counterpoint with, it was also a stylistic difference. Vice President Pence can seem very wooden in his delivery, and it felt like he was reading talking points. And he didn't seem to be speaking in his own voice. He kept quoting President Trump and was there representing the president rather than seeming to represent his own views and take on the relationship. And that contrast was striking. You had a quite long standing ovation for the chancellor, though I would note that Ivanka Trump, who was seated very prominently, did not stand and applaud. And I was told, though I did not see this, that the Chinese and Russian representatives also did not stand after her speech. So you did see some important divisions.
Constanze, on one hand, Chancellor Merkel was, in her own country, on her own ground. On the other hand, the applause that she got might have suggested that, a lot of people agree with her, in contrast to a lot of people maybe not agreeing with the U.S. partners. The rift seems to be growing.
Yes, well, Yeah, there were. The thing here is that there are, in reality, several rifts. There's a big rift going through Europe, of course. That was, if you looked carefully and you knew about it, you could see very well. And there was a rift within the American camp as well. So it's not just a transatlantic rift. Yes, maybe for all of those who weren't in Munich, you have to imagine a hotel that has a storied tradition, is, I would say, slightly past its prime, and that regularly when the Munich circus descends on it, feels, you know, like a 10-ring circus stuffed into a tent that will hold 1 ring. And so it's, it can be sort of quite a challenge at sort of the main points, like the speech, to actually gain entry into the ballroom where the speeches are taking place. But I was inside, and I have to say, it was genuinely moving to see Merkel, who, I have to say, looked more tired than I have seen her in a long time, but was also clearly full of energy. Somebody who was close to her told me afterwards that she'd spent a lot of time during the night writing her own speech. And that's what it sounded like. It sounded like something that she had always wanted to say, and that it sort of came out in sort of bursts of very clear, very focused delivery. It wasn't the sort of careful, technocratic, stilted, measured words that we're used to from her. And here I have to add a funny story. After the conference was over, there was an off-site panel for a youth organization of German Foreign Policy Society in Munich. And the keynote speaker was Christoph Heusgen, who for a long time was her national security advisor. And Heusgen came up to the podium and said, yes, well, we've all heard about the great applause that Merkel got, and this is a bit embarrassing for me, pause. And he said, because people have been joking that now that I'm no longer her advisor, she speaks with much greater freedom. And I have to say that he then gave a speech which really sounded very much like the old Merkel. So, but let me say something about the rift within the American delegation that was visible. You saw, as Karen has perfectly described just now, a Vice President Pence that seemed almost robotic at times, that read off a teleprompter, who seemed to be choking with emotion and expecting applause and didn't get it, and it was all sort of embarrassing. While you had this enormous congressional delegation sitting there, and of course conducting bilats on the side. Yeah. But there was a night owl panel on the Saturday night with, moderated by the irrepressible Jane Harman, former congresswoman from New York, who is now the head of the Wilson Center, and Senator Coons, Congressman Mike Turner, Congresswoman Thomas, I think, from Texas. Sheila Jackson, I'm sorry. Sheila Jackson from Texas, thank you. And finally, Elissa Slotkin, who is a new congresswoman, just come a freshman congresswoman, who was previously with the CIA and has considerable experience in Iraq. And you could really see in this night owl panel efforts from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, to say, we have heard you Europeans, we want to reach out to you, we are very concerned about the transatlantic rift, and we want to work with you even where we have disagreements. And I have to say, I thought that was heartening, and so did all of us. That's good news. But I think what we also need to talk about here, and then I'll shut up, is this rift within Europe. And of course, there's a German-Polish rift that maybe we also want to discuss.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess one of the most emotional manifestations of this, you know, American signals that we will be back was the speech by Joe Biden, the former vice president. And it almost looked as if the US Congress was sending a delegation to Europe to discuss the world after Trump. Is it your impression, Anne?
Let me start by moving back a few levels away from the conference and to give you a slightly broader picture of actually how weird the American attitude towards NATO is right now. Because in some ways, we are now living through certainly since the end of the Cold War, a moment of the greatest American engagement, military engagement in Europe that anybody can remember. There's a bigger American presence here. There are more exercises. As Poles know, there are American troops here. There are also, German and British troops now in the Baltic states. Although Poland was joined NATO, as you say, some 20 years ago, it's really only now, in the last 2 or 3 years, that beginning with the Obama administration, that there's any significant American military presence here. And that presence has a kind of trickle-down effect. So at all kind of different levels of the Pentagon, when you meet and talk to people, I'm sure, Karen, you know this, you hear a lot of, there's a lot of real exchanges, there's real planning going on, there are real relationships being made. Americans feel very devoted to their contacts in Germany and in Poland and in Baltic states. I happened to have been present at an exercise last summer, which was a Special Forces NATO exercise, and it was really quite moving to see people from all over Europe kind of gathered in a tent in an outside of kind of dusty village in northern Poland, planning for a possible invasion of Europe. So it's really it's a deeper and more profound relationship than it has ever been. And I think the congressional representation at Munich was partly a reflection of that. People have colleagues at the Pentagon, people know how much effort and energy is being put into the transatlantic relationship now, as I say, at a higher level than ever before. But what makes it so bizarre, and which is why the Pence speech was so odd, which was very stiff and very aggressive at the same time, is that kind of at the heart of the NATO alliance is this big problem, which is frankly President Trump. Because we really, Trump has made clear over 20 years, this is not a new idea of his, that NATO is a ripoff, that our European allies are taking us for a ride, and he's even written in 1 or 2 of his books, why have so many Americans died in these pointless European wars? Trump represents a strain of American politics dating from the 1930s of really pure isolationism, of a kind that we have not had in power in America, certainly since the Second World War. I mean, there were always people like that in Congress and so on, but they haven't actually played a leading role. And because of that, he puts this, this kind of real uncertainty at the heart of the relationship, and that's why people now pay so much attention to the Munich Security Conference, which actually, it goes on every year no matter what, and lots of business always got done there. But it's become a news item because everybody's waiting to hear, will the representatives of the Trump administration say something so outrageous that the relationship, dies. So this is the tension that's at the heart of the transatlantic relationship right now, is that on the one hand, it's deeper than ever. On the one hand, there's more support for it than ever. There's polling that shows Americans support it quite widely. And yet there is a group of people in the White House who are publicly known to have doubts about it, and whose opinions and whose next moves are entirely unpredictable.
Let me add 2 quotes to illustrate the landscape. One comes from the report called NATO at 70, made by Douglas Luther and Nicholas Burns and others, 2 former US ambassadors to NATO and both Harvard professors. NATO's single greatest challenge is the absence of strong, principled American presidential leadership for the first time in its history. President Donald Trump is regarded widely in NATO capitals as the alliance's most urgent and often most difficult problem, and it goes on. The second quote is from right-wing commentator and author Christian Whiten, published in National Interest just a few days before the conference, under the title "Dump NATO and Defend New Europe." And the author argues that, among others, most of the countries in old Europe have chosen atheism, globalism, multiculturalism, and decadent decline. What exactly are we defending? In Poland, we tend to say that whenever there's a rift coming out of NATO, becoming visible, there are champagne corks popping out in Moscow. And my question, hence, is to you, Henry, how much of the champagne reserve they have in the Kremlin?
Thank you, Marek. listen, I was at a drinks reception with the foreign ministry last month, a lot of the ministers milling around, and I grabbed one of them and I said, oh, you know, there's all these media reports that Trump is going to pull the US out of NATO. And this deputy minister looked at me and he said, I think America will withdraw from NATO when Britain withdraws from the EU. And I tell you that story because there's this idea that Moscow is sat there celebrating, and some people even think pulling the strings of this entire US-Europe rift, and that's completely not true. Moscow is as confused, I think, as many capitals in Europe as to how to deal with the US administration under Mr. Trump and how to gain benefit. I mean, the whole point of diplomacy is that you use contacts and you use leverage and you use business and trade to make life better for you and your interlocutor country. And Moscow is struggling to work out who to talk to, how to get things done, and how to sort of work out defined policy areas. Anne is absolutely right. While the NATO-US-Europe relationship is starting to fray, we are seeing more deployments right up against Russia's border. Talk of Fort Trump is really upsetting lots of Western ambassadors, European ambassadors in Moscow, who are petrified that if the US puts a permanent presence here, or even a semi-permanent or a rotating, however you want to dress it up, the Russians will say, well, fine, we're going to put the same thing in Belarus. And what you do there is you create a symmetrical presence, which is bad news for everybody. And so there's a lot of worry in Moscow that if Poland does take that step, or if the US takes that step, however that step is decided, that actually makes things a lot worse. So yeah, there is a bit of glee, I suppose, that NATO is starting to argue amongst itself, but the actual tangible benefits of that for Moscow are less hard to see. The same goes with the INF Treaty. I'm sure you want to talk about this, but you know, the withdrawal by the US administration looks like a victory for Moscow, right? But they've had this missile for a long time now. Europe has been quite happy with Russia having this missile. Europe has known for a while that the Russians are breaking this treaty, and they're like, that's okay, because in other areas, the Russians are holding to the treaty, and we're allowed to accept that small break. And then Trump comes and says, right, let's take the whole thing off the table. And who loses out? Well, it's the Europeans. And Moscow has been forced into, well, could well be forced into a very expensive arms race, which frankly it can't afford. And you look at the statements from Putin and from the defense ministry in the last few weeks saying we need to look at how we convert our sea-launched cruise missiles to land ones, which is a tacit acknowledgement that they can't afford to develop new land ones. They're going to have to repurpose the ones they already have. And the biggest blow for the Russians is this was one of the last remaining treaties that made them a superpower, that made them the Americans' most important conversationalist on any topic. And that goes away, and Moscow loses another string to its bow. It becomes just another country. The US start talking about China, and all of a sudden it pivots. And what Moscow wants most is to be seen as a really important player. It loves the fact that it has a Security Council seat. This is really important to Moscow. It likes the INF. It likes New Start because it's a relic of the time when Moscow was the most important capital in the world. And just finally, on the Merkel point, there is a lot of worry in Moscow that post-Merkel, they have no idea who to call in Europe. For a long time now, Merkel has been the person who speaks on behalf of the EU to Moscow and vice versa. She speaks Russian. Putin speaks very good German. They have a shared experience. They respect each other. From what I know of their conversations, she's very frank with him. She's very forthright. She kind of goes point by point. Mr. Putin, you said in this meeting, this point, is that still valid, et cetera, et cetera. And that works well with someone like Putin. And just as, you know, this whole call, who do you call when you call Europe? Well, that's an issue for the US, and it's an issue for Russia. And so how Europe comes together in this current NATO, US, EU breakage, and who picks up the pieces, to come back to the original point, is really key for Moscow too, because yes, there's antagonism, yes, there's rivalry, but they need to know who the channels are. And post-Merkel, I don't see who's standing up.
Thank you, Henry, for raising the issue of the troops, because it sort of smoothly leads me to the specifics that I want to debate in this panel. As we all know, Poland is trying to convince the United States to permanently put a significant military presence in Poland. By some people in the transatlantic spectrum, this is seen as buying yourself security. So the question is values versus deals. Is it possible at all to buy yourself security guarantees from the United States, Karen?
That's not the way I like to think about how NATO operates. If we think about what has made NATO such a unique alliance, it's Article 5, and it's the commitment all of the member states have to come to each other's defense. And, you know, as an American, I note that Article 5 has only been invoked once, and it was after the attacks of 9/11 in defense of the United States. And yeah,
by the Europeans who
of course,
initiated
yeah,
against
yeah.
the resistance of the West.
And, you know, when you think about where we are in 2019, the holy grail of NATO for the history of the alliance has been alliance cohesion. And I think a lot of us worry that the overemphasis on spending 2% of your GDP on defense has become the holy grail of NATO. And of course it matters how much you spend on defense. And yes, Germany should spend more. Other European countries should spend more. But that is one of several factors that undergird alliance cohesion. And I think if we overemphasize that one, it actually is quite detrimental. But to pick up Constance's point, there is this larger issue of rifts within NATO. And part of it, and arguably the most important problem, is having a US president, the lead nation in the alliance, who has questioned the staying power of Article 5, questioned whether the US should be defending a country like Montenegro. But beyond that, there are differences of view if you're standing in Paris or Berlin or Warsaw. And I think that's part of the reason it's become so important to Poland to have a permanent basing of US forces in Poland. It's looking for that reassurance because of an overarching concern about alliance cohesion. And I don't know at the end of the day if there's a permanent US base in Poland. We know that the Pentagon doesn't like the idea, not because we are not committed to Poland's defense, but because the US military wants to maintain flexibility. And having a permanent base somewhere, which comes along with US schools and all kinds of infrastructures, is not the kind of mobility the US military wants to have. And so, you know, if you have a persistent presence in Poland, which is what the rotating presence currently is intended to indicate, I think that that is sufficient to make clear to Poland that the US and all of the other NATO allies are committed to the defense of Poland and sending a very clear deterrent signal to Russia that, look, Poland, the Balts, Romania are members of NATO, which Ukraine is not. And there's a very important distinction there. But I think we have to focus on alliance cohesion. And how is it that we as members of the alliance increase our cohesion rather than focusing too much on the percentage that we spend on defense, important as that is?
You spoke about cohesion. When I look back at these 20 years of Poland's presence in NATO, I feel like cohesion was always the goal, but never actually achieved. Perhaps with the exception of this invocation of Article 5 after 9/11. Just weeks after we joined NATO, there was Kosovo. Then came Iraq. Then other stuff. There were always conflicts and divisions and constant adaptation to new realities. Is it something, Anne, that is in our psyche, that we sort of want to believe that unity is a matter of fact, whereas actually unity is something that we are working to achieve, but probably will never do?
So first of all, it's important to remember that NATO from the very beginning has been disunified and has argued about all kinds of things. And if you talk to anybody who's older than about 50 or 60, they can remember back to when NATO was about to break up over Pershing missiles being located in Germany. There's a long the alliance is a thing that's always in flux, and people are always adjusting to the new situation. And I don't think any of that is new or strange. What's strange about the current moment is that we have not had an American president since the Second World War who has openly in the past and even in his current office expressed disdain for and desire to withdraw from NATO. That we have never had before, though we've always had all these arguments. If I could, I'd like to say something just for the Poles in the audience about your the previous issue that you touched on, which is the position of Poland in Europe. I don't know how to say this more clearly, but any Poles who have an idea that they are safe or secure if their only ally in the world is Trump's America, they are making a huge mistake. So Poland is only defensible with the help of Germany. It is only defensible with the help of European allies. And also for the United States, Poland is always going to be a faraway and peripheral country. I know that sounds very harsh to say it, and I'm an American. I have American and Polish citizenship, but unfortunately, from the perspective of Washington, Warsaw is really far away. And the idea that the United States would somehow defend Poland, or as this article in the National Interest said, defend some small part of Europe and not care about the rest, is a kind of fantasy or pipe dream. And the other thing to remember, of course, is that there is, as we heard at Munich, another America. There is Joe Biden's America. There's Nancy Pelosi's America. If that America returns to power, you don't want to be the nation that is somehow identified as being the only the most pro-Trump country in Europe.
Is it as serious as that? I mean, can there be consequences?
I don't want to, I don't want to make any negative predictions, but I'm just saying, as a warning, be careful.
Constanze,
Can I just jump in very quickly, because I want to make sure that people in the audience don't see NATO as a partisan issue in the U.S. This was the importance of 50 members of Congress being there. I mean, President Trump
the mainstream Republican Party supports NATO.
Exactly.
Yes.
So there's a singularity about what Donald Trump says on NATO. And there are really two issues where over the past 2 years there has been and continued to be a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Congress. One is NATO and the other is Russia. And so I just want to make sure that people don't see it as a partisan issue.
Yeah, it's not exactly. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. The mainstream of the Republican Party also supports.
We heard Senator Graham expressing perhaps this kind of. Let me tee your next answer for a second, because I remember Radek Sikorski making appeal to Germany many years ago to take more. Yeah, to take more responsibility. To take more responsibility. Germany itself has been talking about this for a long time, but yet we haven't perhaps seen the manifestation of it.
I'm happy to talk about that, but I have to jump in on this as well. Forgive me. I completely agree with Karen and Anne. The mainstream in American politics, and bipartisan mainstream, is firmly poised to defend NATO. But there is a camp here, and it was exemplified in the recent congressional vote forbidding funding for the president to leave NATO, where the hard right of the Freedom Caucus voted no.
The isolationists.
In the isolationists.
These are
President Trump's
22 members, right?
Still, but they are,
and it's a part of American politics.
They see themselves as Trump's.
I
know. Yeah. But still, the problem is that this view is now represented in the White House by the president himself.
And not to be like the Russian voice here, but Trump won.
Yeah. Exactly.
Trump won the public vote when one of his policies was less spending on American military abroad.
All right. Now let me.
That's not why he became president.
No, but you can't ignore people's manifestos if someone wins a public vote. You can't say, oh yes, you know, like Trump's silly, but you know, people didn't really think.
You're right.
Okay.
No, it's
The thing is that currently he's the president of the United States, and he has significant executive powers.
Yes.
And he is increasingly surrounded by hardliners who pursue, and by that I mean John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and Stephen Miller, who are, while they agree on some things, in perfect alignment with those 22 no votes, on a hard ethno-chauvinist take, nationalist take on politics. So what they're trying to pursue with, say, espousing for Trump and things like that, or embracing Orban, is not bilateralism in NATO, which has always existed, and which we've always managed to juggle against, you know, acting together in the council. They are genuinely embracing the authoritarians and genuinely denigrating those who are not. The dividing line in Europe right now is between those who want a liberal, open society, representative democracy, and a rules-based international orders, and those who are its adversaries. That's our problem. And that's not just a problem in the EU, it's not just a problem in NATO, it's a problem in the transatlantic relationship, because the President of the United States and the Secretary of State of the United States espouse these views. Some of you will have read the speech that Pompeo gave in Brussels, where he said that the EU was, you know, an entity composed of unelected bureaucrats, and it needed to be asked whether it was still fulfilling its purpose, and then later said that institutions that can't adapt need to be I forget the word that he used, but he basically said needed to disappear. I am very careful normally about sort of painting too glum a picture, but I think here we have to take these people at their word. We have to read their speeches and understand what they mean. And I will add one other thing, which I actually wrote a piece about in your newspaper a couple of weeks ago, which is that the former Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, Wes Mitchell, told German diplomats that if they wanted to see a blueprint for this administration's Europe policy, if they wanted to understand the Pompeo speech, they should read a book by Yoram Hazony called The Virtue of Nationalism. And if any of you want to know this, and people like me who are policy wonks, you know, always go read stuff, and then I have to say that I found this book a terrifying read. Because Hazony suggests, and it bizarrely illuminated a lot of the stuff that I had found slightly strange about Pompeo's and Bolton's and other people's utterances. He says there's good nation states and bad empires, and he has two main examples for bad empires. That's liberal interventionist America and the European Union. And he essentially says that the European Union is an aggressive, imperialist, power-seeking, outward-thrusting entity with Germany at its core, which brings us to your actual question. And Germany, and then, in other words, it's just another vehicle for Germany seeking world domination, at which point I needed a drink.
So how can be Germany a reasonable unifier still in this landscape?
Well, I've just written a piece about that. If anybody's interested, I've written it in German, but it's about to come out in English as well, called The Baffled Hegemon, and that as a title already gives you an idea. In other words, I remember vividly that moment when Radek came to Berlin and said, you know, I'm beginning to fear an inactive Germany more than I fear one that's overly active. And that really resonated like a thunderclap in Berlin. It was amazing. It really was. I mean, to be told this by the country that we most worry about, because this is where our ancestors, you know, the generation of our grandparents committed some of the most horrific war crimes in my country's history. Yeah. I mean, this is the bloodlands, Poland and Ukraine. And if there's any country that we seek reconciliation with still, that we want to live in peace with and friendship, then it's Poland. So to have a Polish foreign minister come and say this in Berlin was stunning to people. And I think it had a great deal to do with the drive that then went into the three speeches in Munich in 2014, Gauck and von der Leyen and Steinmeier saying, basically, we need to do more. We need to take on more responsibility. And I watch this very closely. I think that a lot happened. The fact that we have the Luftwaffe in Estonia, guarding the eastern border of NATO, that we have the German army in these missions, that we're in Mali, all these things are deeply meaningful. But at the same time, I think that my country, which I love deeply, is unaware that, and I'm going to be slightly snarky, is that to our neighbors, large and small, we're sort of the Americans in Europe. In other words, we're the 800-pound gorilla that shakes the trees if it just turns around in its sleep. And that is often seen as inconsiderate, and that's putting it carefully, is sometimes ruthless, and is sometimes sanctimonious about being in pursuit of European ideals while it's actually pursuing the national interest, and sometimes doesn't even realize when it's being inconsiderate. And that's there are a lot of people like me who in Berlin are saying, we need to do better at this. We're at fault at some of these things. Nord Stream 2, the trade of surplus, defense spending, all of these things we need to change, but it's a hard slog.
And there's another thing, since you mentioned 2014.
Yeah.
One of these anniversaries that we don't want to celebrate this year. The annexation of Crimea, the war in eastern Ukraine. Germany and France taking the lead role in Europe to solve the problem remains unsolved. Henry.
And look, you only have to look at what happened in the Sea of Azov just before
absolutely.
Christmas to see.
And they're still in prison.
Indeed, mainly to see how Russia essentially doesn't really give a fig about Franco-German policy in Ukraine and in the Black Sea, and just like the Skripal assassination attempt and the hack of the OPCW, this is Moscow saying, on balance, we don't think the Europeans are going to do anything about this. We're going to act with impunity. And the only time they were caught out was the OPCW, when they were caught red-handed and dispatched. They didn't kill Skripal, but they got on an Aeroflot flight with British visas. They did what they needed to do, and they got back on an Aeroflot flight. In the Sea of Azov, they conducted a policy of aggression. They seized the boats, they took the men home, and really nothing much has been done. I think there's been a US destroyer there on 3 weeks maneuvers, and a British one is on its way.
Yeah.
French and Germans are talking about sending some observers. The Russians have said, go for it. We're cool with that, but you can't send the OSCE, because if you send the OSCE, it's acknowledgement that Crimea is Ukrainian. So Kiev and Moscow are fighting with Berlin and Paris about how this is structured, and we're into like the weeds of the legalities here, like essentially what badges are on the arms of these observers. And it's a sign that Moscow doesn't take seriously the Europeans' position regarding Ukraine, and saying, well, we're going to, this is enough. Okay, and then the Donbass happens. Okay, that's enough. And then the Sea of Azov happens. That's enough.
Which leads me to the question to our US friends. Was it a mistake on the US side not to put its weight, to leave the issue to the Europeans?
So yes, I think so. I am sorry that at the Minsk talks there were 2 people who weren't there. I was sorry that President Obama wasn't there. And I was sorry that a representative of the European Union, either the president of the European Council or the head of the foreign policy branch, was not there. It would be a more powerful agreement if there was both a U.S. and an EU presence to it. So
and Moscow wanted the French and the Germans there because for that exact reason.
Moscow prefers the French and the Germans because by themselves, France and Germany are not as powerful as either Europe or NATO.
Yep.
But 5 years on, is there anything the U.S. can do now?
Well, I think actually this touches on a very important question, which is about the role of the U.S. in the world going forward. And this is a question that we Americans have to grapple with or without Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I think, has a singular view of the U.S. role. And as Anne said, you've never had a U.S. president in the post-war period with a sort of isolationist inclination. But if we remember, there's been a lot of criticism of Barack Obama's leadership of U.S. foreign and security policy. Certainly on Ukraine, there's no question that he made a very conscious decision that what precipitated the Ukraine crisis was a disagreement over a relationship to the EU. He did not want to turn this into a US-Russian superpower conflict, and that was why in the first instance he was very comfortable telling or agreeing with Angela Merkel that she would take the lead on this. And to her credit, she did a very successful job of building a consensus in the EU on sanctions, which was not that easy, getting back to the point about different perspectives within Europe. But I think whomever is US president from 2020 on, let's imagine Donald Trump is not reelected. This question about how Americans see their role in the world in the 21st century. And clearly Obama had a view that there was an overextension of US power, that we were engaged militarily in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and it was hard to make the case that we were achieving the results we'd set out for ourselves. So there's this question about retrenchment. And what is it, how is it that Americans see their role in the world? And what's the right mix of hard power and soft power? And I think whoever is US president, they are going to look to Europe to take the lead on what Americans see as regional conflicts, whether that's in places like Ukraine or whether it's in places like Mali. And I think that is something Europeans need to be taking very seriously.
And what happens if Mr. Trump is re-elected, or if Trumpism, if I can call his doctrine as such, survives?
I have to say that I am struck by how much damage President Trump has been able to do in the transatlantic relationship in 2 years. And I say that as someone who initially thought, oh, the American system is resilient and there are lots of checks and balances. But as we've noted, the President of the United States has a lot of power, the largest bully pulpit in the world, and because President Obama didn't have support in Congress for things like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and did them through executive agreement, it's very easy for President Trump to overturn those decisions. So I think that the next year is going to be extremely turbulent because we still have the other shoe of the Mueller report to drop. And I think the president is going to feel the need to continue to throw red meat to his base. So I think it's going to be very turbulent over the next year. And if he wins a second term, he will feel vindicated in everything that he's done. So I think it's hard to see a bright future then in the next, in the next presidential term for transatlantic relations.
Let me get back to my initial metaphor about being 20 within a structure. You might have, as a teenager, you might have done well at school. You've done something. You worked. You earned some money. You earned some experience, but then you realize the world isn't that easy. And it is actually the moment that Poland is facing now. Big issues are coming back, which, to at least my generation have been a matter of the past. And one of those is nuclear disarmament or nuclear issue in the world. Is it possible that in the current state of transatlantic and security relations between Europe, United States, Russia, and China, that we didn't mention, by the way, is it possible to have a new global nuclear deal?
You're looking at me. All right. I think that in retrospect, and I, by the way, remember, I'm older than you are, I think, and I have vivid memories of what a miraculous time 1989 and the decade as linear progress, and though we had left certain things behind us forever. I mean, there is no German that doesn't remember exactly where he or she was when the wall came down, and when the Soviet Union was dissolved, and when we when the European
wind of change was blowing.
Yeah, and when the European and Union and NATO was enlarged. I was at the NATO Enlargement Summit in 2002 in Prague, and I remember the celebrations, which were amazing. I mean, the Czechs put on this astounding festival, some of which was actually a sort of quite let me just call it original. But it was, I just remember the joy everywhere. And I have to say that I got this impression in Munich as well, is that people who lived through all this as adults are genuinely saddened to see the return of things that we thought we'd overcome. Now, I wonder whether we may not have been a little bit naive, and I think the Germans in particular sort of tend to always think, you know, that somehow they deserve to be happy having atoned so much, and which is just, I mean, don't get me started. The other thing, of course, that the Germans forgot is that after 1989 and the enlargement of the EU and Europe, they surrounded themselves with you know, having formerly been nervous frontline states, surrounded themselves with a buffer and exported all their security problems to the periphery, including the eastern periphery of the European Union. And then completely forgot what it had been like to have been a frontline state for all through the Cold War.
But with nuclear weapons...
But to get back to nuclear disarmament, I think what we now have to understand is that we are firmly back in a paradigm of great power competition, and that includes nuclear weapons and other weapons. I think nuclear weapons are important, but let's not forget that the mix is exceedingly made even more dangerous, risky, and volatile by the inclusion of new technologies and hybrid warfare, and that the world of an arms control that consisted in destroying pieces of hardware and taking down numbers is probably over forever.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was on a panel last night, the Anne Will show, if any of you know that in Germany, which was all about arms control, and some sort of German center-left politicians, or left, not center-left, politicians were saying, well, we just need to get the Russians and the Americans to talk about disarmament. And I sat there and said, well, with what army? You know, what are our options here? The INF Treaty was a treaty between America and Russia that stabilized the mutual assured destruction, the sort of, what was it called? The Gleichgewicht des Schreckens. What's that in English, Karen? I'm blanking. Anyway, mutual assured destruction, you know what I mean. Yes, exactly.
Mad doctrine.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it was, of course, to the benefit of the Europeans who in this relationship were not subjects, they were objects. Yeah. And we're now in a situation where America sees itself, is far more concerned with the rise of China, sees the defense and security of Europe as our business, which I think is a very legitimate position to have, and we in Europe are profoundly and deeply divided, including about our relationship with this America and our relationship with Russia. And might I, just one footnote, I can't resist, on this second quote that you had by Mr. Barton in the National Interest. I read that piece as well, and I thought, holy cow, this sounds exactly like Alexander Dugin. I mean, I did not think I would see the time when you would find people writing in the American National Interest, a conservative magazine, writing that sounds as though it came out of the pen of the chief ideologue of the Kremlin. Could have been Surkov as well.
I mean, yeah, and you're giving him a lot of credit.
Is Russia manageable at all in this
Well,
landscape?
I mean, to answer your previous question, I mean, arms control is dead. New START will lapse, whether or not Trump wins again. When Mr. Bolton came to Moscow, he came to say it's over. And then they did a bit of window dressing, and Merkel basically saved face in Buenos Aires getting the extension.
Those 60 days.
It's gone. Nobody cares. And to your point that we're in a superpower paradigm, I mean, the biggest issue here is that Russia still thinks it's a superpower and it's not.
Yeah. Great power.
Great power,
That's
but it's not a great power. I mean, it's a declining superpower with superpower military-industrial complex and pretty much nothing else.
Yeah, but this is exactly why nuclear weapons are back as an issue, because one of the, you know, Russia has a couple of tools. One of them is information warfare, using online propaganda in new and clever ways to infiltrate all kinds of conversations in Europe. And the second one is nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are back, and they matter because Russia cares about them. And Russia wants them to be back, and Russia wants them to matter.
And they're one of the few things that if you're actually struggling to pay for conventional armaments that put you up in that category of great powers.
Well, again, they get you a seat at the table, which
Exactly.
is what they really yearn.
Right.
But Trump is also making nuclear weapons an issue. I mean, he's tweeting about
Yes,
them, he's
that's true.
talking about them, he cares about them.
Right.
They're sort of these
Yeah.
big manly tools
Yeah.
that he likes to think about.
Let's not go there.
And that
really.
plays into Russia's strengths, as Anne says.
Yes.
I mean, this is one of the only things they have left. That and energy supply to Europe.
Yeah.
To your point, we haven't mentioned China at all. And I think it would be remiss if we didn't just spend a little bit of time on that, because I think it's deeply relevant in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, we also, it seems that there's a public view in Europe that we can't really cooperate with the Americans on China because they really want to start a new Cold War, and this time it's with China. But if you talk to European China experts, they have a very similar analysis of the challenge we're facing with China. And it's a cyber challenge. It's a challenge across many different fields. And my view is, when we talk about declining powers, I mean, the rise of China, in my mind, means that there's been a relative decline of U.S. power. And so we are going to be more impactful if we work together with allies, both in Europe and in Asia. One can be critical of Obama administration policy. On trade, they were trying to do that through a Trans-Pacific Partnership and a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership by extending the rules-based order, trying to encourage China to accede to it. Trump administration obviously is trying a very different approach. But it seems to me that we don't spend enough time in the transatlantic relationship thinking about China and the fact that we both care about forced technology transfer, we both care about a lot of these trade issues, and that China is coming west and through One Belt, One Road has come to Europe and is also seeking to divide Europe through its 16+1 initiative. And this was a theme also in Munich, but I don't think that we're grappling with it. And it can also be those of us outside of government who can try to be an engine of building up some of those ideas.
I guess that the technological aspect of it has been emphasized also in this country, because Poland became
Huawei.
a kind of
I mean,
battleground between the United
5G
States and
Absolutely.
China.
Front page of the FT today, Britain saying we're cool with Huawei, like we can handle this. We're not going to listen to the American bullying on Huawei, essentially. Just to that point, you're exactly right on the US-China thing, but how does Russia fit in? Kissinger's great nightmare is slowly coming true right now. Russia is building a 300 billion cubic meters gas pipeline to China. First time ever they've gone east. They're selling S-400s, the most advanced missile defense system in the world, to China. The Americans said, if you buy it, we'll sanction you. They bought it. They sanctioned the Chinese guy, and he said, well, sorry, we bought it now. The Turks are buying it too. The Indians are buying it. This Russia-China thing is not just made up. The trade is massively increasing. It's going to double this year.
Yeah.
Finally, they're starting to sell military technology, which is a tacit way of Putin saying, okay, better the devil you know. We have a difficult relationship with the Chinese, but if the Europeans are going to force us east, we'll go east. We've got to sell what we've got, which is natural resources and defense, and we've got to have friends. They had the biggest war games since the Soviet Union took place last autumn, with the Chinese. Chinese and Russian soldiers war gamed together.
And they were in the Baltics together, weren't they?
And they're doing naval exercises. I mean, this is something America has to take seriously, and so does Europe, because you have to make a decision at some point. How far are you willing to push Russia into the arms of China if China is your future strategic threat? Because we could look back on this and say, well, we really missed a trick there. And what Kissinger said could well come true.
And interesting, I mean, Angela Merkel used this as an argument in her speech in Munich on Nord Stream 2. One of the reasons she articulated that they should pursue Nord Stream 2 is because do we really want to push Russia into the arms of China
That's a false argument, because the Urals. I mean, basically, there's gas on one side of the Urals that has to go to Europe, and gas on the other side that has to go to China. There's no other markets for it.
I have to say, I love this moment, because this is the moment that any moderator on any panel loves most. That panelists begin debating each other. But I need to stress that the next most likable moment is going to happen now. That is opening the debate for questions from the floor. Are there any? Oh yes, please. Please be brief, because we don't have much time left. Introduce yourself and straight to the point.
Good morning. My name is Fabian Saal, and I work for the European Border and Coast Guard. I'm a strategic analyst there. My question to the panel is, what I gather in the media in Munich, there was also a rift between the Germans who believe that we can go back to business as before, and those who in fact believe we can never go back. Where do you stand on this? Is this something you also saw in Munich? And is this maybe the reason why we're not quite getting there? We're not quite improving as fast as we should be in this unprecedented situation.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more questions in the first round. There's a question over there. Ambassador Nico.
Thank you very much to all of you for this very interesting debate. Thank you also for the direct experience from the Munich Security Conference. There was another conference here in Warsaw last week on Wednesday and Thursday.
So we read.
Really? I didn't know
And
that.
I would like to get the opinion of the panel on this conference. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have further question? No. Straight away then. Is it possible to return to business as usual?
Well, so this question about the division between people's views of Europeans' views of the United States. The way I think about this is, so I travel a lot to Europe, and when I'm in Paris, the conversation is all about strategic autonomy. There's a large balance of opinion that feels America has gone bad, and it's not going to change, and Europeans just have to open their eyes, and yes, they're dependent on the U.S. for security and defense today, but they need to double down on autonomy. And then when I go to Berlin, I think there's a group of folks who find that logic very compelling, but I think the balance of opinion in Berlin is still that Donald Trump is singular, and this is cyclical, and the Americans will return to a more traditional policy. So on balance, Germans should pursue strategic patience. And then I come to Warsaw, and my Polish friends are like, what are you talking about? Strategic autonomy or strategic patience? We Poles are all about strategic embrace, because we're not sure we can count on the Germans and the French to defend us against our big bad neighbor, Russia. So that's why, President Duda is offering $2 billion and calling this base Fort Trump. So I think there are very different views across Europe. And I did not have the sense in Munich over the weekend that that inner European rift had been healed. So, that would be my take on that, and maybe I shouldn't answer all.
Is it possible at all to be a good friend with Mr. Trump and be a good European at the core of the EU?
That depends a lot on what Trump and his team do next, whether they decide to pursue, as they've hinted they will, much greater efforts to break up the European Union. When we don't know yet quite what that looks like. We see some pieces of a strategy. And actually that leads me to the other question about the conference last week. I actually spent a little bit of time last week trying to understand what the origins of that conference were. I talked to people in Washington about it. What was the point of it?
Which was probably the right address.
Don't know whose idea was it? Where did it come from? And I think actually the original idea was to show some kind of U.S.-European solidarity about Iran. And then when no such solidarity appeared, and when a number of senior Europeans said they wouldn't come to the conference, then they invented lots of other issues to add on. Okay, let's talk about the Middle East peace conference. Let's talk about a peace process. Let's talk about a few other things. I'm sorry to say that the other thing I learned was that nobody in Washington took the conference very seriously. There was very little reporting about it. Because by the time it actually happened, everybody understood that it was a kind of, the point of it was to give Pence a place to speak before he got to Munich. The point was to give Netanyahu a place to speak before his election campaign.
Right.
It was a kind of conference that was being used by various participants to make statements, that would make them. Unfortunately, it started out as one thing. It became something quite different.
And it also led to a not insignificant rift between Washington and Warsaw, because your prime minister ended up not going to the Visegrad 4 conference.
No, Tel
you
Aviv
mean
and Warsaw.
the Israel.
Tel Aviv.
Israel.
Yes, but that, I know, but that surely was also part of the sort of the overarching narrative.
I mean,
while that was going on, Ambassador, I was in Russia reporting on a separate conference that was taking place in Sochi.
A competition.
Right, well, this is oh my God. The other point. There was a different conference taking place, which was more important.
To put it into perspective, you had the Vice President, you had the Prime Minister, you had Netanyahu, you had a smattering of European mid-level, I'd say, but in Sochi you have Rouhani, Erdogan and Putin getting right down to details on Idlib and what happened in Syria. And there's no Europeans there, there's no Americans there, and Rouhani actually was asked a question in the press conference, you know, are you aware of what's happening in Warsaw? And he was like, oh, it's ridiculous, they can't even come up with their own policies, it's such a joke. And it was pretty incredible to hear him say that and to sort of acknowledge that there were these two conferences going on, and you've got Putin with his two buddies, you've got Pence with the Poles and the Israelis, and this massive divide. And it's the Iranians, the Turks, and the Russians that are actually discussing the real issues and actually deciding how Syria, the future of Syria, what it's going to look like. And that has huge implications for the security of the Mediterranean, security of Turkey,
Black Sea,
the NATO alliance, and the Black Sea. Turkey, everyone forgets, Turkey is the biggest military power on the Black Sea. Putin needs Turkey if he's going to sort of slowly push the EU out of there. And the fact you've got this talking shop in Warsaw where it sounds like everyone was just being nasty about everybody else and getting upset. And in Sochi, they're actually deciding things. For me, it was striking. Our coverage made sure that those two stories were interlocked in the same story, because at the FT we felt it was really important that you saw the dichotomy.
Well, let me add one other location to this where meetings didn't go so well was Budapest. And this meeting with, Pompeo's meeting with Orban, I think showed very clearly the limitations of this administration's policy with regard to Hungary. Now, Wes Mitchell has always made the case, and I'm sort of willing to give him the benefit of the doubt of that the Hungarians were being frozen out by the Obama administration, and that if one wanted to prevent them from going sort of fully into the arms of the Chinese and the Russians, then they needed to be embraced more. Yeah. My sense is that
it's failed.
It's completely failed, absolutely. And that this, in other words, really undermines the Eastern European policy of this administration. And I think that leaves Poland in a really difficult spot.
I don't think that probably most people in Poland know the degree to which the Hungarian-Russian relationship has developed.
Orban is the only leader who has had bilateral relations, bilateral visits with Putin every year, I think, for the last 5. I mean, it is very tight, very close.
And there have been a number of recent incidents. The Hungarians, somebody sought by the U.S. government was extradited to Russia.
Right.
The Hungarians can do continual favors to Russia, and they do it as a kind of almost in defiance of the U.S.
The Russians are building their nuclear power station. I mean, this is close.
And now add to that that Orban and Salvini are the leaders of a movement with a capital M, advised by Steve Bannon, which is something I don't take seriously, but he seems to pop up whenever he's sort of least wanted, to gather together European hard-right parties and create a pro-Russian bloc, if you will, within the European Parliament, with the goal of, at minimum, creating a blocking minority, a blocking group within the EP to prevent regulatory progress, or at best to flip the European institutions. And these are the people and the governments on whose side this American administration is on. You have to see this in its full ghastly glory.
But why doesn't? Here's the question: why doesn't the Polish government see that?
Yeah, that's well.
You tell us.
But what do they agree on? I mean, even Salvini and Orban are like, we're together, unless it comes to migrants, because we don't want them coming here. Salvini's like, well, you've got to take them. I mean, there's hardly any alliance on actual policy. It's just kind of rhetoric.
But read the Orban speeches.
It's an election mechanism for both of them.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is that while Salvini, to me, Salvini seems like a straight-on sort of neo-fascist. Orban actually has an ideology of Europe that is spelled out, and that he has been expounding in great detail in his summer school speeches. every year, which you can read in translation.
Very hypocritical.
But isn't the difference that the EU is still giving money to the Hungary, whereas Italy is being told to pay money to the EU?
But my point is that it is possible to know what Orban wants. It is possible to understand what his take on Europe is, and it's very close, unfortunately, to some of the stuff you hear from the Kremlin, or some of the stuff that you can, or what you can read in Hazoni's book. And what I find astounding is that we see an alliance of authoritarians, of people who despise representative democracy, who despise a liberal open Europe, and who despise a rules-based international order.
But for the time being, he is still in the EPP, and the Salvini's attempt in Warsaw
Yes, and that, believe me, is a bone that I...
Any more questions from the floor?
Yeah.
Oh yes, please.
And he's getting support from the CSU, sadly.
And from Lord
Maciej Miłosz, Dziennik Gazeta Prawna. I've got a question on NATO, European allies. Do you think they do deliver in terms of building capabilities? Because you said they do not deliver on money, and that's kind of obvious. You said it's not that important, so what is important?
How much time do we have to discuss this?
Look, the problem here, of course, the elephant in the room is Germany's failure to come up to 2%. Yeah?
But do you think the issue is in the numbers, really?
No, I don't.
No,
Of course not. Yeah. I mean, the numbers are a crude metric. I personally actually think that that Ursula von der Leyen and the defense ministry and the German defense establishment are trying really, really hard to push out, to spend enough to repair the Bundeswehr's capabilities, and that there is an historically unprecedented amount of agreement in Germany's political camps about the necessity of doing this, including in the center-left, including with the Greens and the Social Democrats. That's no longer controversial, and it was on display at this chat show I was in last night, which included Germany's foreign minister and a fundamentalist Green like Jürgen Trittin, who all said we have to do this.
Do you think, Henry? Do you think that Russia really cares about European defense capabilities?
I mean, until Europe cares, Russia won't care. I mean, this is. I find it quite interesting how all this pushback against the EU army idea, right? Yeah. The problem with defense policy, when people think of defense policy, they think about tanks and guns and defending against armies. This doesn't happen. It happens very, very infrequently. Defense policy is mainly about procurement, industrial military complex, who's buying from who. Yeah. If you're under a NATO umbrella, you're buying US weapons. Essentially, NATO is a fantastic lobbying tool for US military. Europe needs to develop its own weapon systems if it's going to be safe and secure in an unstable relationship with the US. And so when you have these countries like Poland kind of pushing back against the EU army, like that surprises me, because if you have a joined up EU army and a joined up EU defense policy, you have joined up military construction, technology, countries being able to fund each other and build each other's tech, not relying on the Americans. And so it does surprise me, actually, how anti kind of the EU army a lot of these countries are that want to build their own domestic military industry. Does Russia take the EU army seriously? No. Because they know that you're not going to have a French division leading a German tank and all this stuff. It doesn't work. NATO is still the biggest threat to Russia, and they do take it very seriously. And there's always these flybys in the Baltic and things like that. That is them sparring. But the EU army doesn't. Until the Europeans take it seriously, the Russians won't.
So the Russians do not. The Russian fear of the West is not primarily a military fear. They are not afraid that NATO will invade Russia.
Exactly.
They don't believe that. Yeah. What they are afraid of is the appeal and the attraction of the West, and they are afraid of Western democracy rhetoric of the kind
soft power, basically,
that motivated the revolutions in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014, and in Moscow in 2011. Yeah. And that's why the primary Russian tool against the West right now is rhetorical. Yeah. It's support for extremist political parties. It's support for anti-European and anti-American narratives online. It's payment of trolls and the use of the attempt to manipulate the internet, as well as, I should say, tools of cyber warfare. Yes, they are thinking a lot about how to take down our electricity systems at key moments. They practice these kinds of things in Ukraine. We know that's what they're trying to do. This is why thinking about the transatlantic community as merely a military alliance is always a mistake.
Yeah.
It's important to think about it
Absolutely.
as a alliance of like-minded countries who are able to work together across a range of areas, not just military, but also in cyber, where we are all very interconnected, and also to begin to think about the deeper problems of how to regulate the internet and social media, which we can really only do together.
And on that point, NATO, I think, is very much behind the Russians in terms of capabilities. They're catching up. And this is cheap. For basically the price of a decent missile defense system or a week's worth of gas supply to Europe, Russia can fund this kind of warfare. It's very, very cheap.
Well, can I make a point about what Anne just said now, the sort of aversion of this administration against the EU? There are two ways in which we are not just objects but subjects in the world, and one is as a trade power, and the other one is as a standard setter. And that is not coincidentally where the Trump administration, and particularly John Bolton, are most concerned about taking us down. This is what economic coercion, sanctions, and tariffs are about, and this is also a concern with us taxing or regulating the big tech companies. That's trade and tech are going to be the real battlegrounds of the transatlantic relationship. And that's where we are genuinely in a kind of systemic competition. It shouldn't be that way. The Obama administration tried very hard to do it otherwise. And the world will be a safer place if we find back to a transatlantic conversation where we can have a peaceful and collaborative trade and tech relationship.
I just wanted to play off Anne's important point that what Russia is scared about is the attractiveness of our societies, mixing it with the comments about tech. Because the reason the Russians are having success with these cyber weapons is because they're very cleverly playing on splits that exist in our society. They're not creating them, they're playing off them. And so, there's this NATO bumper sticker, we can only be strong abroad if we're strong at home, and it takes on a new resonance today because we all do need to be stronger at home. And if we can't make a compelling case that our liberal democratic model serves the vast majority of our own citizens, we are going to lose that attractiveness to other places. So, I think one important takeaway for all of us is we need to do some real work within our own societies if we want to have a strong, robust transatlantic relationship and beyond.
Our clock is flashing red. I know we could continue for hours, but I have to thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you to the audience for listening to us for such a long time. And enjoy your coffee. The next panel starts after the break. Constanze, Henry, Anne, Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you.